The moment the clock struck 3, the city changed. Or maybe time itself shifted, bending under something unseen. Emma's eyes snapped open to a bedroom she knew like the back of her hand, but something was wrong. Shadows pooled in corners where there should have been light. Her reflection in the mirror was delayed, almost lagging, like it belonged to someone else, or someone waiting to step out. The air smelled of burnt metal and old ash, and her heartbeat thumped in rhythm with something far older. She wasn't alone. Across the city, whispers crawled into every quiet room, in apartments, offices, and hospital wards. Not words exactly, but questions, soft, accusing, gnawing at the edges of consciousness. Do you remember what you denied? Who did you fail? People woke screaming, eyes wide, shaking violently, their hands pressed to furniture as if it could anchor them to reality. But reality was slipping. Clocks ticked backward. Phones displayed memories that never existed. Mirrors showed more than reflection. Familiar faces distorted in terror, shadows moving against their will. Something had invaded the spaces between sleep and wake, and it was hungry. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at a quiet suburban home, their car headlights cutting through fog that hadn't been there a moment ago. They had sensed it, the presence lurking behind every flicker of light, the same one that made Emma shiver alone in her bedroom. Lorraine's hand tightened around her journal. Ed's cross glinted as if it recognized the danger. This wasn't like any demon, poltergeist, or spirit they had cataloged. This was different, patient, calculating, waiting for humanity's smallest betrayals, doubt, guilt, denial. It thrived in silence, in things left unsaid, in truths buried deep where no one would look. Somewhere across town, a fire erupted inside an empty warehouse. Not flames of heat, but spectral black smoke that coiled and writhed like living shadows. Workers called it an electrical fault, but Ed felt the pull in his bones. This was no accident. This was a prelude. In the same instant, across the city, hundreds of minor disturbances erupted. A glass shattering in a high-rise, a candle blowing out in a hospital chapel, the echo of footsteps where no one walked. The world was bending in tiny, imperceptible ways, but together they added up to chaos. Emma's bedroom door creaked open. She froze. Her breath hitched as the shadow in the mirror grew taller, darker, and sharp, as if something was stepping closer from another world. Her reflection stayed, but it smiled differently, mockingly, knowingly. The whispers were louder now, a tide of voices rising inside her skull. Then the smell of burning leather filled her nostrils. Her knees buckled as a skeletal hand, wreathed in hellfire, appeared on her windowsill. Ghost Rider. He didn't speak. He never did. His chain rattled like thunder in a storm, each clink a promise. Fire licked his skull, yet the flames carried a coldness that gnawed at the soul. Ghost Rider was here, but not as savior. He was a judge, a breaker of boundaries, a force drawn to punishment. And yet something in the air told him even he hadn't seen this before. Something was twisting reality itself, something older than demons, older than sin, older than death. Emma's fear sharpened to pain as visions assaulted her. She saw herself fail people she loved, betray truths she swore she'd keep, all magnified until the air trembled with judgment. The room fractured around her, walls bending, furniture levitating, mirrors splitting into jagged shards that reflected more than light. They reflected guilt, fear, helplessness. A scream tore from her throat, but it didn't echo in her room. It went elsewhere, feeding the entity that had started it all. The Warrens arrived in time to see the spectral fire twist and pulse, dark shapes forming inside, human and inhuman, writhing like smoke in a tornado. Lorraine's eyes widened. It's feeding on nightmares, but these aren't just random fears. It's targeting memory, choice, regret. It's rewriting reality. Yes, she whispered. Ed tightened his grip on the cross. Whatever it is, it's not coming alone. And it wasn't. Ghost Rider raised his chain, sparks flying, and with a roar of hellfire that split the distorted night, He stepped fully into the house. Shadows recoiled. The nightmare paused. The thing watching from the edges hissed, tasting the fire. Reality wavered. And for a heartbeat, the city was still. But that pause was only the beginning. The walls of Emma's room twisted like wet clay, ceiling folding onto the floor and floor folding into the ceiling. Shadows slithered across every surface, taking shapes that were almost human, but wrong. Limbs too long, eyes too dark, mouths opening in silent screams. Ghost Rider's skull burned brighter, illuminating the room in hellfire that crackled with soundless electricity, yet the shadows recoiled as if they knew him. The entity behind the nightmare had sensed something primal, something it hadn't faced in centuries. Emma's knees hit the floor, her hands pressed to the carpet as reality shifted beneath her. A whisper came again, louder, closer, wrapping around her thoughts. "You cannot stop it. You belong to me." And then her own voice joined it. "I've always failed." She spun in panic, but the room was a labyrinth now, hallways stretching into infinity, doors opening onto nothingness, mirrors reflecting lives that weren't hers. Panic surged in waves, and with it, the fire from Ghost Rider's chain cut through the warped air. He swung it slowly, deliberately, sparks dancing like living stars. Outside the house, Ed and Lorraine braced themselves. The neighborhood had gone silent. Cars froze in mid-motion, streetlights flickering like dying embers, dogs barking into invisible corners. Lorraine whispered a prayer, but her eyes betrayed her fear. This isn't just a haunting, it's an invasion of the mind. Ed gritted his teeth. Then we fight it there. Wherever it is, we face it together. He gripped the cross, feeling heat from a reality war he hadn't yet fully seen. Inside, Ghost Rider advanced, and the shadows reacted violently. Figures emerged, faces from Emma's past, her family, friends, teachers, but twisted, accusatory, eyes hollow and sharp. "You left me. You lied. You deserve this." They lunged with silent fury, the air thick with dread. Ghost Rider's chain lashed, cutting through apparitions, igniting the nightmare in bursts of blue and orange fire. The screams of the spectral echoes filled Emma's ears. Yet she felt a strange clarity, like the fire burned away the lies, revealing the truth beneath her fear. Lorraine and Ed entered through the front door, crossing a threshold that was no longer a door, but a vortex of shadow. Lorraine's eyes widened as she saw the room stretch impossibly high, the ceiling filled with countless screaming faces. Ed's hand trembled slightly on the cross, but he steadied himself, stepping into the warping space. Ghost Rider turned, flames licking at the edges of his skull, and for the first time, Lorraine saw something terrifying. The fire didn't just repel the shadows, it drew attention, pulled the entity out, made it visible. And then the nightmares multiplied, not just in Emma's room, but everywhere at once. Across the city, alarms screamed, lights flickered, and people woke screaming from nightmares that weren't theirs. Ghost Rider's presence became a focal point, tethering the entity, anchoring the chaos to something tangible. He moved silently, chains whipping, skeleton on fire, fire that burned cold and hot at once. Every swing shredded illusions, but new ones sprang up faster. It was as if the nightmare was learning, adapting, each time trying to flank him from another angle. Emma screamed. A door appeared before her, solid and familiar. Her childhood bedroom. She ran through, but inside her parents sat calmly, smiling. And then the illusion cracked. Their eyes were black pits, mouths stretching unnaturally wide. She stopped. Ghost Rider appeared beside her, fire casting shadows that danced across the wall, revealing the hidden truth. She blinked and suddenly she saw it. The entity was feeding on her guilt, her regrets, her fear of failing others. But Ghost Rider, he didn't see fear. He saw reckoning. Ed and Lorraine arrived behind them, chains of protective wards drawn on the walls in hurried scrawls, wards that pulsed with energy when touched by Ghost Rider's fire. Lorraine's hands hovered, fingers trembling. She whispered to the entity, trying to communicate with its shadow. "You have no claim here. You feed on lies, not reality." The shadow recoiled, but it laughed, a sound that vibrated the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Then it surged forward, tendrils of black mist wrapping around the trio. Ghost Rider didn't hesitate. He swung the chain, and a strike of hellfire tore through the shadow, splitting it into writhing pieces. The fragments hissed, slamming against invisible walls, shrieking in fury. Emma stumbled, clinging to the firelight, and for a fleeting moment, she realized something. The nightmare could be fought, but only if fear was abandoned, if guilt didn't control her reactions. Every time she panicked, the shadows grew stronger. Every time she steadied herself, Ghost Rider's flames consumed more of the darkness. And then the impossible happened. The entity reached out beyond Emma's mind, touching the memories of Ed and Lorraine, pulling at their deepest fears. The lives they couldn't save, the spirits they failed, the mistakes they carried silently. Ghost Rider's chain flashed again, faster, sharper, burning a path through the tendrils of despair. The shadows screamed as though in pain. Emma realized that this was bigger than her room, bigger than the city. The nightmare was trying to infect the entire world through human consciousness, linking fear, memory, and guilt into a single, unstoppable storm. But Ghost Rider's presence had made one critical difference. The entity could now be seen, and anything seen can be fought. The battle was far from over. Outside Emma's house, the world began to warp. Streetlights flickered, street signs bent like molten metal, and cars stopped mid-motion as if caught in a frozen heartbeat. Across town, people awoke screaming from nightmares they didn't understand, their fears bleeding into reality. The entity wasn't limited to Emma anymore. It had learned the pattern of human consciousness, stretching its influence outward like a dark tide. Ghost Rider rode into the chaos, the roar of hellfire echoing down the twisted streets. Each step of his flaming wheels seared reality itself, burning a path through the darkness. Shadows shrieked as they recoiled from the flames, tendrils that had reached into homes and offices, snapping back, hissing. Emma clung to the firelight, her hands trembling. But for the first time, she felt a thread of control. Fear was no longer the master. It was a tool, one she could wield alongside the rider. Lorraine called out, voice barely audible above the spectral screaming. "It's everywhere! This thing! It's using memories, using regret to tie us to it." Ed's hands moved frantically, casting wards and crosses, desperate to contain pockets of the nightmare. But for every ward placed, a new tendril slithered out, invisible and precise, aiming for minds it hadn't touched before. It had become an intelligence, a predator that learned from each strike, each attempt at resistance. Ghost Rider moved like a storm. Chains whipped across empty streets, arcs of blue and orange fire cutting through the black fog. The shadows shrieked and split, attacking in swarms that multiplied faster than they could be destroyed. In one alley, Emma saw her childhood friends appear as monstrous forms, their laughter twisted, their limbs broken in ways impossible in reality. She screamed, but Ghost Rider's fire licked the air between them, illuminating the truth. They weren't real. He gestured, and the illusions dissolved into nothingness. But the nightmare adapted. The shadows began to target Ghost Rider indirectly, manifesting as debris, as twisted architecture, as sounds that mimicked familiar voices. They whispered secrets only the person hearing them could know, planting doubt and guilt in subtle, insidious ways. "You failed them," one voice murmured into Lorraine's ear. "You should have stopped it sooner," another hissed to Ed. Even Ghost Rider flinched slightly as the shadows tried to bend the fire around him, twisting it into jagged shapes, trying to use the rider's own energy against him. Emma stumbled, caught between terror and focus. She realized something horrifying. The entity didn't just feed on fear, it thrived on hesitation. Every second she doubted, every time her eyes wavered from the shadows, it grew stronger. Ghost Rider paused beside her, flames glowing brighter, and she understood what she had to do. Not fight alone, not run, stand. Even when every instinct screamed to flee, stand. The fire wasn't just protection, it was a bridge, a tether to the real world, to resistance. Across the city, the nightmares intensified. A subway train derailed before it even left the station, passengers frozen mid-scream, shadows climbing over the cars like crawling smoke. Office workers saw their co-workers as hollow-eyed wraiths, accusing them of betrayals they never committed. Children saw their parents contorted into grotesque shapes, demanding obedience, love, fear, everything at once. The city was no longer a city. It was a maze of terror, each corner a trap, each reflection a lie. Ghost Rider roared, hellfire bursting from his skull, flames illuminating the chaos in streaks of light. Shadows recoiled violently, their shrieks turning into pain, fractured cries. He swung the chain in a wide arc, burning paths through streets, alleys, and buildings. Emma followed, holding to the heat, feeling courage she didn't know she had. Every step forward was a step against the impossible, every swing of the chain, a claim of defiance. Lorraine's hands moved faster, inscribing protective symbols that glowed when touched by Ghost Rider's fire. "It's feeding off human memory," she yelled. "Cut the connection. Don't let it touch anyone else." Ed nodded, moving like a man possessed, forming pockets of protection around those trapped in illusions, whispering reassurances that kept minds tethered to reality. The entity roared in frustration, lashing out, breaking apart the wards in jagged flashes of black mist. But Ghost Rider's fire stayed relentless, a line of light no shadow could fully cross. Then came the scream, piercing, wide, unrelenting. The entity had coalesced, a single, monstrous form from the thousands of fragments, towering over the city like a living nightmare. Every street, every home, every mind it had touched shimmered in its presence. Ghost Rider's flames surged brighter, the chains swinging faster, and Emma felt it, her own fear transforming, fueling the rider, creating a shared energy that pushed back the darkness. For the first time, the entity faltered. It shrieked, twisting violently, unable to fully manifest without the psychic connections it had relied on. Emma realized something terrifying and beautiful. If fear could feed it, courage could starve it. And with Ghost Rider and the Warrens, she could make courage more contagious than fear. The nightmare hadn't ended. Not yet, but the first cracks had formed, and the city, caught between despair and defiance, trembled on the edge of a revelation. Fear was powerful, but it could be fought. The entity had grown monstrous. Shadows now formed a writhing colossus that towered over the city, each tendril stretching into streets, homes, and minds alike. Its voice was a chorus of every fear it had consumed, overlapping, echoing, whispering, accusing. Every scream in the city fed it, amplified its presence. The ground shook, lights shattered, and the air thickened with dread. Even Ghost Rider felt a pull, a weight pressing against his flames, trying to extinguish the light he carried. Emma's hands were slick with sweat, but her eyes were sharp. She realized the truth. The entity wasn't just a monster, it was a mirror. Every fear, every guilt, every unspoken regret of those it had touched had been woven into its form. To fight it with fire alone would never be enough. Ghost Rider understood this instinctively, letting Emma lead them through the streets, the heat from his flaming wheels carving paths where the shadows couldn't follow. "Emma!" Lorraine shouted over the cacophony. "It's drawn to you. All of this. It centers on your fear, your memories." Emma swallowed hard, heart hammering. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like prey, but she knew hiding would make it stronger, would let the city fall deeper into despair. And she had something the entity didn't anticipate: choice. As the Colossus raised a tendril to strike, Emma stepped forward, shouting with every ounce of courage she could summon. "I see you!" The words rippled through the darkness, shaking the entity like a stone through water. Ghost Rider's flames roared, chains whipping the air, striking shadows that flinched from the heat. Lorraine's wards blazed, and Ed's voice cut through the nightmares, naming fears aloud, exposing the illusions. The entity recoiled, a wave of distortion pulsing outward. For a moment, the city froze in suspended terror, then continued moving in hesitant steps. People who had been trapped in illusions, children clutching imaginary parents, workers facing hollow versions of coworkers, blinked, startled, free from the suffocating grasp. The Colossus faltered, shaking violently as if losing cohesion. Ghost Rider surged forward, fire burning brighter than ever. The entity lashed out, and shadows collided with fire, sizzling, twisting, but failing to consume it. Emma's voice rang again. "I am not afraid of you. You are nothing but my memories twisted." Every word she spoke seemed to strike the entity, splitting fragments of shadow that dissipated into smoke. Lorraine and Ed moved in tandem, guiding civilians through the chaos, forming a living barrier around Emma and the rider. "Do not let it touch them," Lorraine shouted. "Do not let it feed." Ed's hands glowed, crosses igniting with bursts of energy that burned away small shadow tendrils, trying to attach themselves to the minds of the frightened. The entity screamed, a sound that shattered windows, rattled bones, and warped the air. It tried to rise, to tower taller, to consume more fear, but its structure was unraveling. Every person who remembered courage, who took a shaky step forward despite terror, weakened its hold. Emma realized the final truth. It wasn't fire, magic, or even experience that would defeat it. It was defiance. Ghost Rider's chains swung, slicing through a massive shadow arm and burning a trail of light across the Colossus. Emma stepped into the center of the chaos, arms raised not in surrender, but in resolve. Her voice, trembling but firm, spoke aloud every memory it had tried to manipulate, naming each fear it had twisted. "You are only a shadow. You are not me. You are not them. You are nothing." The entity quivered violently, each tendril snapping and recoiling. It shrieked, the sound now fractured, discordant, fading. Shadows flailed, breaking apart into smoke that the morning wind carried away. Fire, wards, courage, every element of human defiance converged into a single point of power, and the entity could not withstand it. And then silence. The streets of the city were scorched and twisted, but empty of nightmares. Ghost Rider's flames dimmed to embers as he slowed, chains rattling softly. Lorraine and Ed stood among the shaken survivors, tending to those who were faint or frightened. Emma's chest heaved, but she felt something new. Not relief, not victory, but presence. She had faced the darkness at its strongest and had refused to bow. That refusal alone had shattered the entity's hold. Yet the city felt fragile. Emma knew, deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. The entity had been dispersed, not destroyed. It had learned, adapted, and now it would wait. But humanity had learned something too. Fear was powerful, but courage, even trembling, hesitant courage, could be stronger. Ghost Rider paused beside her, flames flickering. "You did well," he said, voice low and gravelly. "This isn't over, but you've shown it what humans can do." Emma nodded, understanding the weight of the words. Victory wasn't in erasing fear, it was in choosing to act despite it. Lorraine whispered, "We'll need to prepare. This wasn't just a night terror, it's an intelligence now. It won't forget." Ed's expression hardened. "And we won't either." Emma looked at the city, at the people emerging from the shadows of their own minds. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. Fear would return, shadows would rise again, but she, the rider, and those willing to stand would face it, and next time they would be ready. For now, the first night had been survived, and survival, Emma realized, was its own kind of victory. The city slept uneasily, unaware of the storm that had merely shifted its shape. Shadows had receded, but they lingered in corners of the mind, tracing every heartbeat. Emma felt it first, a whisper in the dark of her apartment, the faint scent of burning leather and ash that wasn't really there. She sat upright, sweat clinging to her skin, realizing with a jolt, the nightmare wasn't gone. It had only moved. Ghost Rider was restless too. The rider's chains rattled softly as he circled the streets below, eyes ablaze, searching for disturbances that had no visible source. He had sensed it in the residual fear still echoing through the city, the way darkness lingered on thresholds, waiting for the moment to invade dreams. "It's learning," he muttered to himself, the flames flickering against the night. Every fear it touches becomes a doorway. By midnight, the first invasion began. People stirred in their sleep, murmuring names, struggling against shadows no one else could see. Lorraine arrived at the hospital first, wards glowing softly in her hands, guiding the frightened, stabilizing the fragile veil between sleep and reality. Ed worked in tandem, running from one ward to the next, his voice steady but strained, naming the illusions aloud, dissecting the fears like a surgeon removing diseased tissue. Emma's apartment became the focal point. She awoke with a jolt to see her room twisted, the walls elongating, the windows bleeding shadows, and every personal memory she had ever tried to bury projected before her in grotesque detail. Her parents' voices, distorted, begging, accusing. Friends she had wronged standing in silent judgment. And above it all, a towering, flickering shadow, the entity she had faced earlier, watching, waiting, learning. "Not again," she whispered, her hands trembling. Ghost Rider appeared at her window in a burst of flame, chains lashing. "This time it's different," he said, voice low, gravelly. "It's inside minds. Every thought, every fear. You can't fight it the same way." Emma swallowed hard, heart hammering. "Then what do we do?" He exhaled fire, smoke curling like a warning. "We survive, and we lead them through it. Nightmare is its battlefield, but not all nightmares are ours to conquer alone." As the entity began pulling at her mind, memories twisting into grotesque parodies, Emma realized it wasn't attacking her physically. It was testing her, probing for weaknesses, exploiting every doubt she had ever felt. The city's residual fear fed it, but her own fear anchored it. To fight it, she had to confront not just the entity, but herself. Lorraine appeared behind her, wards pulsing with energy. "Focus on what's real, Emma," she said. "Your memories are yours. Let the shadows touch them, but do not let them rewrite your story." The entity responded instantly, amplifying personal guilt, isolating her in hallucinations so vivid she could feel each heartbeat of those she had failed. Ghost Rider's flames roared, slicing tendrils that reached for her, but every attack seemed only to awaken deeper fears. Emma gritted her teeth and closed her eyes. She let herself sink into the nightmare intentionally, letting the visions unfold. Faces twisted, buildings collapsed, familiar streets warped into corridors of accusation. But instead of screaming, she spoke aloud. "I have survived. I am here. I will stand." Her voice echoed, reverberating against the entity's form. Shadows quivered, recoiling, as the entity realized her defiance was voluntary, conscious, not reactive. Meanwhile, in other parts of the city, similar scenes unfolded. Ordinary citizens, plagued by residual nightmares, began to fight back in small human ways, naming fears, refusing to kneel to them, holding onto fragments of reality like fragile talismans. Lorraine and Ed guided them silently, their presence unnoticed, uncelebrated, but crucial. The entity, sensing resistance, escalated. Entire blocks seemed to ripple like water, warped by fear-induced illusions. People woke to find rooms inverting, streets stretching impossibly. Loved ones replaced by twisted doubles. Ghost Rider and Emma navigated these streets, chains and courage blazing, cutting paths of light through the waking nightmare. And then came the first trap. A city block froze entirely, caught in a shared illusion where everyone saw themselves failing catastrophically, every regret amplified. Emma felt the pull, the suffocating weight of collective guilt. Ghost Rider's flames struck, burning the illusion from the outside, but the effect was limited. The entity had learned to exploit shared consciousness, and it was hungry for despair. Emma realized with clarity, this was no longer just survival. It was a test of collective will. The nightmare had become a network, a psychic web connecting every mind it could touch. To break it, she needed more than courage. She needed unity. And to achieve that, she would have to convince the terrified, exhausted, fractured minds of the city to act together. The first night of the dream invasion closed with streets still trembling, visions still echoing. But one truth had emerged. Fear could no longer control them outright. Emma and Ghost Rider had survived the first personal trials, but the war was just beginning. Dawn never came clearly. In the city, the sun's light struggled to pierce the shadows that had settled in overnight. Streets twisted and stretched like rubber. Buildings leaned impossibly, and every reflective surface mirrored a world that wasn't real. Citizens stumbled, caught between reality and nightmare, their own minds betraying them. Fear had become a city-wide contagion, and the entity, learning faster than any human could, was everywhere at once. Emma ran beside Ghost Rider, his flaming skull illuminating corridors of warped concrete. She kept her voice steady, repeating aloud the truth she clung to. "This is real. I am alive. We are alive." Each word became a tether, pulling the illusions back from the edge of reality. Yet the entity adapted instantly. Sidewalks erupted with shadowy figures, twisted versions of neighbors, co-workers, friends, shouting failures, echoing guilt, forcing hesitation. One misstep could mean permanent mental collapse. Lorraine moved through the streets too, unseen, guiding citizens with subtle gestures and wards etched into doors and windows. Ed's presence was quieter, but no less essential. His voice carried across rooms, cutting illusions by naming them, reminding people of their reality. Alone, each human was fragile. Together they were dangerous. The first true challenge arose in the central square. Entire city blocks seemed suspended in dream logic. Fountains ran blood, pigeons spoke in mocking voices, and the air shimmered like heat over asphalt. People froze, paralyzed by fear. Emma recognized the signs immediately. The entity had anchored itself to collective perception. This was no longer personal. It was communal. Ghost Rider leaped forward, chains snapping against the air, severing some illusions. But every strike only seemed to split the entity into smaller forms. Emma realized it. The entity wasn't just a single consciousness. It was a hive of fear, fracturing into every mind it touched, learning faster than they could react. "Emma!" a voice called. She turned to see a child, no more than 10, standing firm in the chaos, hands clasped over his ears as if holding himself together. "You can't scare me," he shouted. Something inside her shifted. Resistance wasn't about destroying the entity. It was about refusing its space. She grabbed his hand and spoke aloud, deliberately, each word a chain against the nightmare. "We are alive. You cannot control us. You cannot take our world." Around them, others began to join in, their voices small at first, then growing louder. They didn't fight with weapons. They fought with acknowledgement, with refusal, with the simple act of being present and conscious. Ghost Rider observed, flames flickering in approval. The entity shrieked, a sound that rattled windows and bones alike. But it didn't retreat. It adapted again. This time, the nightmare began blending memories and reality, forming impossible hybrid visions. Familiar streets collapsing into alien geometries, loved ones smiling before turning to shadows, sunlight burning like fire. Emma felt herself pulled into a memory of failure, a hallucination of a moment she had tried to forget. Her body froze, but her mind forced words. "I survived. I am here. I will stand." Her defiance rippled outward, touching the others. People joined in, voices overlapping in chaotic harmony. Fear recoiled. The entity hissed, temporarily fragmented by the sheer weight of human will. But the battle was far from won. Shadows retreated only to regroup, emerging elsewhere. Entire neighborhoods were trapped in loops of repeating panic, citizens experiencing the same moment of terror over and over. Emma realized that persistence was as important as courage. Exhaustion could be a weapon the entity wielded more effectively than any nightmare. Ghost Rider and Emma moved through one such block. Flames cut illusions away from storefronts, chains smashing hallucinations projected onto the streets. Yet every attack triggered new illusions, new memories, deeper regrets, more subtle fears. The entity had evolved, learning that aggression alone could not subdue resistance. It was Lorraine who finally gave direction. She moved to the center of the square, raising wards high. "We stabilized the network," she said calmly. "This is a battle of attention. Focus together. Not on fear, on being real." Citizens followed her lead, forming small clusters, speaking aloud their truths, their small victories, their refusal to bow. Emma joined, feeling the city pulse beneath her feet, not in fear but in quiet defiance. She knew the entity was watching, learning, adapting, but for the first time it wasn't winning unchallenged. Their voices became a chorus of resistance, imperfect but persistent. Shadows shivered and fractured under the combined strength of conscious, defiant minds. And yet the entity struck back with a cruel subtlety. Dreams began to bleed into reality, stolen minutes of sleep becoming hallucinations during waking hours. A mother in a park screamed as she saw her children morph into shadowy doubles. A man running late at work saw colleagues whispering accusations no one else could hear. Exhaustion, isolation, disbelief. These were the new battlegrounds. Emma understood then. The nightmare invasion couldn't be fought from the outside alone. It required internal fortitude, the deliberate act of seeing through illusion, and the courage to persist despite fatigue. Ghost Rider's flames could carve paths, but they could not protect every mind simultaneously. The night drew on, city streets flickering between nightmare and reality. And in the chaos, a quiet truth emerged. The entity was powerful, adaptive, and relentless. But so was humanity, if it refused to succumb. Small, ordinary acts of defiance, speaking truth, holding hands, standing firm, became weapons sharper than chains or fire. The city survived the night, fractured but unbroken. The nightmare had spread, reality had bent, and people had stumbled. But they had also begun to rise. Emma, Ghost Rider, Lorraine, and Ed, guided by courage, not hope alone, had proven that even a learning, evolving entity could be resisted. And as the first faint rays of sun touched the twisted city skyline, Emma understood. The entity was not defeated, but it had met its match. Humanity, in its imperfect, exhausted, stubborn defiance, had learned to fight nightmares on its own terms. The city had survived the first night, but dawn brought no relief. Shadows lingered in corners, drifting across streets like smoke. Reality was no longer stable. Windows reflected moments that had never happened. The sky rippled as if painted with watercolors of despair. People spoke to echoes of themselves, questioned their own memories, and doubted even the solidity of the ground beneath their feet. Ghost Rider moved like a burning sentinel, chains lashing at shifting illusions. Yet every strike seemed to fracture the world further. Buildings cracked, twisting in impossible angles, staircases looping back into themselves. Emma ran beside him, clutching Lorraine's hand as wards glowed faintly beneath their fingers. "We can't fight this alone," Lorraine murmured, voice steady despite exhaustion. "This is a war of perception. Every mind counts." And the entity, learning faster than ever, attacked not just fears, but identities. Citizens were forced to confront versions of themselves they didn't recognize. A man saw himself betraying his family. A nurse relived every life lost under her care, magnified 1,000 times. Children saw futures where they caused unspeakable harm. Each hallucination was precise, intimate, designed to break will and sow despair. Emma's own mind was not spared. She stumbled into an alley only to find herself face to face with her own doppelganger, smiling, confident, mocking. "You can't protect anyone," it whispered. "You fail. You always fail." Emma felt the familiar sting of doubt, the fear that maybe she had always been powerless. Ghost Rider's flames reflected in her eyes, reminding her of the fire that couldn't be extinguished. She forced herself to speak aloud. I am real. I am here. I will not be broken. The doppelganger faltered just enough. Lorraine moved with precision, guiding citizens to small sanctuaries, helping them anchor to truths that could not be twisted. Their love for family, the laughter of friends, the memories that defined them. Ed stayed close, his voice cutting through hallucinations like a knife. Name it, he instructed repeatedly. This is not real. It is fear. You are alive. You are here. But the entity evolved yet again. It learned from resistance, targeting not fear but fatigue. Sleeplessness became a weapon, hallucinations began during waking hours, and the city's inhabitants stumbled from exhaustion. People who had stood strong before now wavered, unsure which visions were real, which choices mattered. Emma realized the entity's ultimate power was not terror alone, it was the slow erosion of persistence. Ghost Rider roared, flames licking the twisted skyline. But even his power had limits. He could carve paths through shadows, but he could not protect every mind simultaneously. Each citizen had to fight their own nightmare, and failure could ripple outward, destabilizing the fragile network of resistance. The breaking point came at the Central Plaza. A young woman, barely conscious from the relentless psychic assault, screamed as she saw herself standing over lifeless friends she had never lost. Her fear erupted into the collective, igniting new shadows across the city. Emma ran forward, placing herself beside the woman, anchoring her with touch and words. This is not you. You are alive. You are here. Breathe. We stand together. The city reacted slowly, imperceptibly at first. Voices joined hers, neighbors, strangers, anyone able to speak against the weight of illusion. We are here. We will not break. Small clusters of people repeated it, a chorus growing from whispers to shouts. Even the doppelgangers and hallucinations began to falter, splintering under the unexpected power of human will aligned, even imperfectly, against the entity. Yet the entity struck its most insidious blow. Ghost Rider's flames flared, and suddenly the air thickened with visions of loss. Every person he could not save, every life touched and failed, projected onto him in an endless loop. He faltered, chains trembling. Emma shouted, grabbing his arm, "You are not alone. None of us are." Slowly the fire stabilized, the illusions breaking as he remembered why he fought. Because people refused to bow, even when despair surrounded them. Lorraine and Ed coordinated simultaneously, guiding groups of citizens to ground themselves in shared reality. Rituals, simple words, gestures of recognition, all small but vital acts that formed chains of resistance stronger than any magic or nightmare. People were no longer passive. They were participants in holding the city together. By nightfall, the city was scarred, streets twisted and shattered, but the entity's attacks had begun to lose cohesion. Fragmented illusions persisted, but the synchronized assault had failed. Emma, Ghost Rider, Lorraine, and Ed looked across the plaza at a city that was broken but unbowed. In the quiet moments before the next wave, Emma realized the truth. The entity thrived on fear, fatigue, and doubt, but it could not survive the collective insistence on reality, the deliberate act of presence and defiance. Every citizen who refused to surrender their mind was a sword in the battle, every act of acknowledgement a shield. And somewhere in the shadows the entity recoiled, adapting but cautious now. It had faced something new, humanity refusing to be manipulated as a whole. It could strike individually, but the network of resistance, imperfect and chaotic as it was, had proven a force even it could not fully predict. Emma felt exhaustion wash over her, but also a strange exhilaration. The city had survived another night, reality had bent and cracked, and yet people had held on. The nightmares had escalated, twisted minds and tested limits, but the core truth remained unbroken. The human will, even weary, could defy darkness. The city was on the edge of collapse, streets twisting like molten glass, the sky an unsettling swirl of reds and blacks. Every moment of calm was borrowed, and every shadow could contain a nightmare. Ghost Rider rode through the streets, wheels flaming against the warped asphalt, chains lashing out at impossible illusions that bent reality like paper. Lorraine and Ed moved among the scattered survivors, anchoring them, whispering truths, weaving fragile webs of resistance. The entity had grown bolder. No longer content with isolated visions, it now manipulated entire blocks, shifting whole neighborhoods into endless loops of despair. People wandered endlessly, chasing family members who vanished as soon as they approached. The boundary between the waking world and the nightmare had dissolved. Every corner of the city was a potential trap. Emma felt the entity brush against her mind again, probing, testing. This time it was different. It knew her, remembered her resilience, sought to overwhelm her with her own fears magnified. She saw visions of Lorraine lost, Ed silenced, Ghost Rider chained in flames he could not control, and worst of all, citizens giving in, kneeling to despair. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to breathe. "We are here," she whispered aloud, a mantra repeating like a drumbeat against the chaos. "We are here. We will not bow." From the north, Ghost Rider's voice echoed, raw and commanding. Fear dies in the fire of presence. His flaming chains struck the shifting illusions, and for a moment, reality itself quivered, breaking the loops, creating gaps the citizens could anchor to. Emma ran into one such gap, helping a terrified boy see the truth. He was alive. He was not alone. He had a choice. Lorraine sensed the entity's intelligence sharpening. It was no longer merely reactive. It had begun anticipating their moves, learning from each failure, each act of defiance. Its attacks became more intricate, personalized, surgical in precision. Citizens faced visions tailored to their deepest regrets, every act of courage mirrored with counterexamples of failure. Emma saw it in the terrified eyes of people trying to flee, visions of loved ones harmed, opportunities missed, moments of guilt magnified until the heart quaked. Ed coordinated small sanctuaries within ruined buildings, lighting wards, guiding people to anchor themselves in memory, truth, and recognition. But even he felt the strain. Every hallucination was heavier, longer, more immersive. Each survivor who faltered threatened to unravel the fragile network holding reality together. Then Ghost Rider acted. He rode into the heart of the chaos, chains thrumming like a heartbeat. Flames licked at the warped buildings, purging the nightmare's material forms. And Emma, realizing the pattern, shouted to the remaining citizens, "Focus on one truth, just one. You are here. You are alive." Slowly, tentatively, voices rose across the city, a chorus of small affirmations piercing the night. The entity recoiled. It had underestimated the collective human will, the persistence of presence even in exhaustion and terror. It struck harder, attempting to crush the city with the most devastating illusion yet, a vision where every hero, every anchor, every citizen succumbed simultaneously. Lorraine and Ed shouted instructions, guiding people through the hallucination, helping them distinguish fear from reality. Ghost Rider burned through the manifestations, but they reformed instantly, twisting faster than before. Emma's mind was assaulted again, this time by a vision of her own failure magnified 1,000-fold. The city was aflame, citizens kneeling, Lorraine and Ed vanished, Ghost Rider chained and silenced. And yet, through the suffocating pressure, she felt something new, the small, unbroken voices of the citizens. She grasped at them, repeating aloud, "You are here, you are alive, you are present." Across the city, the chorus grew. Even the terrified, exhausted, almost broken people began to echo the phrase, each repetition striking the entity like a blade. Its attacks faltered. Hallucinations shattered into shards of darkness. Ghost Riders surged through the remaining fragments, flames brighter, hotter, slicing through the illusions that had threatened to drown the city. The entity's voice, once thunderous and commanding, now trembled. You resist. You persist." Its form flickered violently, unable to maintain cohesion as human will countered each strike. It lashed out one final time, targeting Emma directly, probing for a crack, A moment of doubt. She faltered, saw the worst of all possible outcomes. But she breathed, anchored herself to the real city. Real citizens, real hands holding hers. She refused the illusion, refused the despair, and in that refusal, the nightmare began to collapse. Reality snapped back violently, warping streets straight, walls returning to their proper angles, skies calming. Exhausted citizens fell to their knees, gasping, shaken but alive. Ghost Rider's flames dimmed to a steady glow, chains resting at his sides, eyes scanning the recovering city. Lorraine and Ed moved among survivors, grounding them, affirming each life. Emma collapsed against a wall, trembling, but smiling through the tears. The entity had been forced into retreat, its presence diminished, fractured, unable to maintain its assaults. It would return, perhaps, stronger or cleverer, but for now, humanity had resisted. It was not victory in the conventional sense, but something subtler, infinitely more important. They had chosen presence over despair, connection over isolation, will over surrender. As the first rays of dawn touched the city, casting long shadows across the streets, Ghost Rider's flames flickered once more, a warning and a promise. Emma, Lorraine, and Ed knew this was only the beginning. The entity had learned, adapted, and evolved. But so had humanity. They had survived the nightmare's apex, and in doing so, discovered a new strength. The city breathed again, quiet but alive, and somewhere beyond perception, the entity watched, calculating, frustrated but wary. For the first time, it had met resistance it could not fully dominate, and that hesitation would linger, shaping its next move. The city lay in a fragile stillness, the air thick with the remnants of fear and smoke. Broken streetlights flickered against cracked asphalt, and windows reflected distorted silhouettes of a world barely holding itself together. Ghost Rider rode slowly through the streets, flames now subdued to a cautious glow. Chains resting at his sides. The screams, the visions, the relentless pressure of the nightmare. Those were gone, but the echoes lingered, in minds, in hearts, in the very fabric of the city. Emma moved carefully among the survivors, her hands gentle on shoulders, her voice low and steady. "You survived," she reminded them, though the words felt inadequate. The terror they had endured couldn't simply be erased by reassurance. Each person carried a fragment of the nightmare inside them, and the challenge was not to conquer it entirely, but to integrate it, to learn that fear could coexist with choice, that trauma could exist without ownership. Lorraine and Ed had set up temporary sanctuaries in the few intact buildings, rooms lined with candles, wards, and simple comforts. Blankets, water, quiet corners. Here, people could anchor themselves, speak if they wanted, or simply breathe. Ed had begun cataloging each encounter, every hallucination, every act of defiance. "We have to understand this," he said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "We can't just wait for it to come back. It learns." Ghost Rider dismounted near a square where a group of survivors huddled, staring at the ruined remnants of their homes. Children clung to parents, their faces pale but bright eyes darting nervously as they processed the chaos they had endured. Ghost Rider knelt, flames curling gently around him, and spoke with an authority that was both terrifying and grounding. "Fear is a shadow. It cannot touch you unless you invite it. You chose life. You chose presence. That choice is yours. Always." A woman stepped forward, trembling, holding the hand of a young boy. "But what if it comes back?" she whispered. "What if it's stronger next time?" Ghost Rider's skull burned brighter, yet not in anger, in acknowledgement. "Then you choose again," he said simply. "Each time, you do not surrender. You endure. You act. That is power." Emma felt the weight of their gaze, the mixture of gratitude and terror. They were survivors, yes, but they were fragile survivors, untrained in this new kind of war. Every word, every gesture mattered. She moved among them, teaching small techniques, focusing on what was real, on presence, on connection with the world around them. It was exhausting and yet necessary. The city might have been free of immediate nightmare, but the entity had left its mark in every mind it touched. In the distance, a shadow shifted unnaturally, even in the soft light of dawn. Lorraine noticed first a ripple that didn't belong. The entity had retreated, yes, but it had not been destroyed. Its presence lingered, testing, probing. Emma sensed it as well, a subtle pressure at the edges of thought, a whisper promising despair if vigilance waned. She clenched her fists, refusing to acknowledge it fully, forcing herself to focus on the living, the tangible, the human. Ed turned to the group, his voice low but firm. We can't wait for heroes to appear again. The last attack proved something crucial. Presence matters more than power. Every act of care, every shared moment, every acknowledgement of fear, these are the weapons we have. The survivors listened, some nodding, some unsure, but all understanding the gravity of the statement. The war was no longer about spectacle. It was about endurance, attention, and small, deliberate choices. Ghost Rider stood, flames flickering higher as he surveyed the square. I will ride the edge of their reach, he said, voice echoing unnaturally, but you must hold the center. Do not allow despair to claim it. Every time you act, you weaken them. Every time you connect, you diminish their hold. That is how you fight what cannot be fought with fire alone. Lorraine stepped beside Emma, placing a hand on her shoulder. It will return, she said quietly, but we've learned something. We can survive it now, and next time we will be ready. Emma nodded, aware of the tension in her own body, the lingering tremor in her hands. She had faced visions of death, loss, and failure, yet she was still here. And more importantly, the people she protected were still here too. The city remained in ruins, but movement returned. Small acts of rebuilding, tentative conversations, shared food, children playing cautiously among the debris. The survivors were beginning to claim their space again, to anchor themselves in the real rather than the illusory. Each choice, each acknowledgement of existence, each shared laugh or tear was a victory. In the shadows the entity observed, its form distorted, fragmented, but attentive. It had learned that fear alone could not dominate this city. Presence, connection, endurance. These were obstacles it had not anticipated. It retreated further into the fringes, but it would return, adapting, testing, probing. And the heroes and survivors would have to be ready. For now there was fragile relief. The city breathed, imperfectly, unevenly, humanly. Emma, Lorraine, Ed, and Ghost Rider moved among the people, their presence a stabilizing force, a reminder that even when darkness returned, there would always be those who stood, who chose to act, who refused to kneel. The nightmare had been survived. The war, however, had only just shifted. Night fell slowly over the city, a blanket of muted blues and grays that made the broken streets seem both familiar and alien. Shadows clung to every corner, stretching unnaturally, bending over cracked asphalt like dark fingers reaching for the living. Ghost Rider patrolled silently, the faint glow of his hellfire tracing his skeletal outline, chains coiled and ready. But tonight, it wasn't brute force that the city needed. It was awareness. The entity had learned. It no longer struck openly, no longer relied on the immediate shock of mass terror. Instead, it whispered. Small distortions at the edges of perception. A familiar voice in a child's ear. A fleeting glimpse of a dead parent. A sudden sense of guilt and inadequacy that pressed against the chest. Survivors awoke in the middle of the night, hearts hammering, unsure if the threat was real or imagined. Emma moved through one of the temporary shelters, checking on families and individuals who had experienced the brunt of the invasion. She found a young man, Daniel, sitting on the floor, shaking, mumbling to himself about shadows moving inside his room. It's not real, she said softly, kneeling beside him. You're safe, you're awake, you're here. His eyes, wide and frantic, betrayed disbelief. But I feel it, he whispered. It's in the corners, watching. Emma nodded. She had felt it too. A subtle pressure in her mind that made thinking linear thoughts a challenge. Then we watch it back, she said, choosing words carefully. You are not alone, and you are not powerless. Lorraine had begun organizing small networks of survivors, teaching them to anchor themselves in reality, to verify perception with another person, to resist the creeping despair. The entity feeds on isolation, she explained to a small group. It cannot dominate those who are connected. Watch each other, speak, share, anchor. The survivors nodded, some hesitant, others skeptical, but each understood that survival was no longer just physical. It was mental, emotional, and collective. Ed, meanwhile, was compiling patterns. He observed the attacks, noting the moments when people were most vulnerable, late at night during exhaustion, when guilt or doubt took hold. It's adapting, he told Ghost Rider and Emma. It's learning what breaks the spirit fastest. Not everyone can stand against fear. Not yet. We have to predict, prevent, and counter, not just react. Ghost Rider's flames pulsed as he considered the words. He could burn through manifestations, chase the illusions. But this entity had transcended that. It was a predator of the mind, not the body. Each subtle influence it exerted on the city's inhabitants was a test. Each failure it induced was a harvest. But that also revealed its weakness. It relied on hesitation, on surrender. Presence, choice, and action weakened it. The first organized counteroffensive began quietly. Survivors formed groups, patrolling streets, checking on neighbors, sharing food, offering reassurance. Ghost Rider guided them with a combination of authorities and presence, his flaming skull both terrifying and comforting. Fear cannot win here, he said. Not if you refuse to kneel, not if you act. Each group anchored themselves in tangible reality. They lit candles, cleaned streets, tended fires, and shared stories of survival. These small acts, mundane as they seemed, became barriers against the entity's whispers. But the entity was relentless. One night, Carol Danvers joined the patrols from above, using her cosmic awareness to monitor for anomalies. She noticed a cluster of hallucinations converging near the hospital district. Patients saw doctors as monstrous versions of themselves, nurses as shadowed threats, family members twisted by the entity's influence. Panic threatened to spread. Carol landed amidst them, wings glowing softly, projecting a calm that stabilized perception. It's not real, she instructed firmly. Breathe, look around, you are safe. Wanda worked separately, entering dreams briefly, not to dominate, but to reveal the mechanics of manipulation. She showed individuals how the entity twisted memory and perception, stripping the terror of its omnipotence. A child who had been haunted by visions of being trapped forever suddenly realized that the nightmare followed patterns, not choice. The realization sparked a rebellion in the mind. Fear lost control, and with it, the entity's power. Thor returned to the city with deliberate humility, walking among survivors without hammer raised, kneeling beside those in despair, admitting failure alongside them. We all fall, he said to a group rebuilding a collapsed home. We rise together. His presence reminded people that vulnerability was not surrender, and that strength existed in acknowledgement, not domination. Yet the entity continued to probe, adapting its strategy. It avoided large gatherings, targeting individuals with quiet, seductive offers, promises of peace, relief from guilt, and freedom from responsibility. Rest, it whispered. Let go. Let someone else bear this. Many faltered under exhaustion, the weight of constant vigilance pressing down. But Emma, Lorraine, Ed, and the heroes reinforced the truth. Surrender was never mandatory. Effort mattered more than perfection. Choice mattered more than fear. By the end of the second week, the city had stabilized. Panic no longer spread unchecked. Small victories compounded, each act of awareness, resilience, and human connection eroding the entity's hold. It retreated gradually, forced to adapt once again, recognizing that brute terror was no longer enough. It would need cunning, subtlety, and patience. And the heroes and those they had protected were ready to meet that challenge together. The war had changed. It was no longer about chasing nightmares. It was about cultivating endurance, connection, and awareness. Fear still existed, but now it met resistance in every act of choice, in every shared burden, in every human connection. And the entity, observing from the shadows, understood that the battlefield had shifted and that this city would never kneel without a fight. The city held its breath. Streets that had begun to hum with cautious life now seemed suspended, poised on the edge of something immense and unseen. Even the air felt different, thick, almost liquid, carrying whispers that slid into ears without warning. Ghost Rider's flaming skull glowed brighter than usual, chains rattling in anticipation as he moved through the darkened alleys. He sensed it before anyone else. The entity was preparing something far larger than scattered terror. Inside the hospital district, lights flickered erratically. Patients awoke screaming, hallucinations converging into cohesive forms. Lorraine moved swiftly, guiding nurses and staff to ground themselves in reality. "Do not follow them," she warned. "The shadows are illusions. Remain anchored." Even she felt the pressure in her mind, a whisper curling around her thoughts, promising safety if she would only surrender her awareness for a moment. She clenched her teeth. Surrender had no power here. Clarity did. Across the city, Carol hovered above the rooftops, scanning for distortions with her cosmic senses. She saw it, a lattice of nightmares, stretching across blocks, morphing from fragmented hallucinations into solid, terrifying presences. People stumbled into walls that weren't there, saw loved ones twisted into accusatory specters, and felt guilt crystallize into tangible weight pressing against their chests. It was an assault not just on the body, but on the essence of humanity's mind. Ghost Rider's flames roared. He understood what had to be done. "It thrives on isolation," he muttered to Emma and Ed. "If we fight alone, it wins. If we fight together, we can push it back." Chains whipping, he struck at the converging nightmare forms, flames searing illusions into smoke. The screams faded, replaced by the echoing whisper of the entity. "You cannot stop me. You are all weak." But the heroes had learned. Wanda entered the nightmare matrix, not to dominate, but to reveal the structure beneath the chaos. Faces of terror flickered, showing patterns, repetitions, connections. People realized they were not trapped by fate, but by fear of the unknown. Each revelation ignited defiance in the mind, small but accumulating, a spark in a dark ocean. Thor strode into the streets, hammer at his side, kneeling beside those trembling with visions of failure. "Even gods fall," he said to an elderly man shaking in a doorway. "Even gods are afraid. But courage is not absence of fear, it is choice." The man's hands clenched around Thor's, holding on not to the god, but to the assertion that he mattered, that his fear did not dictate reality. Around them, more people began standing, refusing the subtle coercion of the entity. Carol joined in the fray, intercepting manifestations in midair, absorbing bursts of psychic energy before they could reach the living. Ghost Rider coordinated from the ground, guiding civilians to act as anchors, their presence fragmenting the entity's reach. Ed moved among the people, noting vulnerabilities, suggesting microactions. "Hold a hand, speak a name, describe the moment you are in. Don't let the shadows claim your attention." Small choices, repeated, multiplied. The entity's form became visible at last, a shifting, colossal figure, neither entirely human nor entirely demon, looming over the hospital like a storm cloud of dread. Its voice rolled through the streets, a blend of every whisper it had ever used, every fear it had cultivated. "You cannot resist," it boomed. "I am inevitable." Ghost Rider lifted his chains high, the flames flaring to their maximum. "No, you are an echo of what people fear," he shouted. "We are real, we are present, we act, and that is stronger than you." Flames struck the creature, but it recoiled differently this time. Not destroyed, but fragmented. Each act of resistance, each refusal to surrender, chipped away at its cohesion. Inside the nightmare, Wanda's interventions synchronized with the hero's physical actions. She drew threads of the entity's manipulations, unweaving illusions, showing the truth beneath each terror. Panic faltered. Courage emerged. Children who had been paralyzed with fear cried out for their parents. Adults responded, holding hands, grounding one another in reality. Thor's voice thundered, not with judgment, but with clarity. We do not kneel, we do not vanish, we continue. Every group of people that acted together forced the entity to recede slightly, its towering figure flickering, unstable, its voice losing resonance. It tried to adapt, but the pattern was clear. Unity, awareness, and choice were poison to it. By the time the first light of dawn crested the horizon, the nightmare lattice had collapsed. The entity retreated, slipping through cracks in perception, retreating into the thin spaces between realities. Wounded but calculating, the city exhaled collectively, though everyone knew the war was not over. Fear still existed. Shadows lingered, but the survivors, guided by Ghost Rider, Wanda, Carol, and Thor, had discovered something vital. Terror could be resisted, not with force alone, but with presence, clarity, and shared humanity. As streets emptied of illusions, Ghost Rider's chains clattered softly. "It's learning," he said to Lorraine and Emma. "It won't give up, but neither will we." The city, though battered and trembling, was alive. The nightmares had been broken, but not without cost. Sleepless eyes, exhausted bodies, hearts still heavy, but hearts that chose to continue, to stand, to act. That choice was a wound the entity could not heal. And somewhere beyond sight, the entity paused. Its awareness stretched thin, calculating the next move, realizing that this war would be unlike any it had ever fought. For the first time, it understood the depth of human defiance, the quiet strength of persistence. The battle was far from over, but humanity had proven it could resist. Dawn broke slowly over the city, a pale light that seemed almost hesitant to touch the streets still scarred by shadows. The remnants of the nightmare lattice lingered, shimmering at the edges of vision, like a memory that refused to fade. Civilians walked cautiously, eyes darting, hearts heavy, but each step carried a small, quiet defiance. Ghost Rider moved among them, chains coiled but unneeded for the moment, watching faces that had survived a confrontation with the impossible. Lorraine stood on the hospital steps, hands resting on her knees, breathing ragged but steady. Around her, the staff and patients clung to one another, murmuring reassurances, forming fragile circles of reality that held the shadows at bay. She looked up as Ghost Rider approached, flames dimmed but still glowing softly, and met his hollow gaze. "It's gone for now," she said. "But it's not finished." "No," he agreed, voice low, echoing through the empty street. "It learned. Every fear we faced, every choice we made, it cataloged. It will come back. But it won't be the same. Neither will we." Carol hovered nearby, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. But her eyes carried the steady fire of someone who had faced loss and despair and refused to surrender. "We bought them time," she said. "That's what counts. The rest, they have to keep walking themselves." Her words weren't a comfort, not yet. They were a truth heavy with responsibility. Thor's hammer had returned to his belt, but his presence was no less commanding. He walked through the streets with measured steps, kneeling beside those who still shook, offering simple words, not grand pronouncements. "You endured what gods themselves would fear," he said to a man clutching his knees on a broken stoop, "and you remain. That is victory enough." The man's trembling eased, small hope flickering in his eyes. Fragile but alive. The nightmares had not vanished entirely. Here and there a shadow flickered in a corner. A whisper echoed in a hallway. But the collective resistance, the refusal to surrender individually and together, had forced the entity to fragment, to retreat into the thin, uncertain spaces between worlds. It was no longer an unstoppable force, but a predator cautious and calculating, waiting for weakness, for exhaustion, for despair. Wanda knelt in the center of the hospital atrium, palms resting on the floor, chaos magic faintly rippling around her. She had entered the minds of hundreds, unraveling threads of terror, guiding people through their worst memories without allowing the entity to dominate. The effort had drained her completely, leaving her on the edge of collapse. But the results were undeniable. Faces once frozen with terror now held clarity, a fragile awareness that survival did not require surrender. Even Ghost Rider recognized the cost. Flames flickered weakly, chains dragging through dust. His skeletal jaw tilted toward the horizon. This war, he said quietly, almost to himself, isn't about who hits harder. It's about endurance, about making sure no one gives in when it matters. His words hung in the smoky morning air, heavy with truth. Civilian volunteers began organizing themselves, checking on neighbors, guiding the disoriented, forming small pockets of order out of chaos. Ed and Emma coordinated with them, offering instructions not as leaders, but as facilitators, showing people how to reinforce their own perception, their own presence. Every small act, a hand held, a voice spoken, a steady breath, was a weapon against the invisible assault. As the sun climbed higher, the entity's manifestations became weaker, scattered, indistinct. It had learned that fear alone could not manipulate this city anymore, that nightmares were ineffective when met with persistence, unity, and conscious defiance. It would return, but it would have to adapt, strategize, and expend energy in ways that had previously been unnecessary. In a quiet corner, Lorraine and Wanda exchanged a glance. "It'll come again," Lorraine said, voice low, "and next time, it'll know more." "Yes," Wanda replied. Her fingers brushed the edge of the floor, chaos magic still trembling faintly. "But so will we. We know now. We can teach others. We can prepare them, not to be fearless, but to endure." Thor joined them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Even gods learn," he said, voice soft but resonant. "Even gods stumble. The difference is choosing to rise anyway. They have chosen. And that choice is the enemy's undoing." Ghost Rider finally turned, chains coiling with renewed purpose. "It's wounded," he said, "and we've seen its limits. But the war isn't over. It never is. We fight in the shadows, in the quiet moments, in the spaces it thinks it controls. That's where we win." The city exhaled collectively, weary but alive. Windows reflected the first golden rays of sunlight. Streets glimmered with the remnants of night, and even the smallest whispers of laughter carried the weight of defiance. People moved again, slowly, imperfectly, but moving nonetheless. Somewhere beyond the thin veil separating dimensions, the entity lingered, its colossal form flickering like dying embers. It had been forced to retreat, not through brute force, but through the persistent choice of the living to remain present, aware, and unbound. It observed humanity's resilience with a calculated, silent fury, realizing for the first time that control would never be absolute, that fear was not a permanent dominion. And in that knowledge, a strange uncertainty took root. The war had shifted irrevocably. Humanity was no longer a passive field for nightmares. It was a living, breathing force, imperfect, exhausted, but unbroken. The heroes gathered in the streets as the last echoes of darkness faded. Ghost Rider's skull glowed faintly in the morning light. Wanda's eyes reflected both relief and exhaustion. Thor's hammer rested lightly against his side, and Carol's posture radiated quiet determination. They had survived the storm, but the battle had left its mark, and as they looked toward the horizon, all understood one truth: the entity would return. But this city, this world, had discovered a weapon it could never anticipate: endurance, choice, and the simple, relentless act of standing. For now, the night had passed. The aftermath of terror had been survived, and the war, though far from over, had found its first crack in the shadows. The world had barely caught its breath. Streets were littered with traces of chaos, yet life had resumed with stubborn insistence. Children ran along cracked sidewalks, neighbors greeted each other hesitantly, and somewhere in the distance, the hum of traffic carried the ordinary sounds of a city surviving. But beneath that fragile normalcy, something stirred. In the thin spaces between dimensions, the entity that had once shattered minds and twisted realities hovered, fragmented but far from defeated. Its form flickered and pulsed, no longer a coherent shadow, but a storm of nightmares and echoes. It had observed, cataloged, and most importantly, it had learned. Fear alone had failed. It needed something more insidious, something subtle, something that would invade not through sheer terror, but through the erosion of hope. Lorraine had sensed the shift first. She felt it in the quiet hours, when the city seemed to sleep, but her mind could not rest. Whispers curled around her thoughts, faint but precise, teasing images of loss and failure. She closed her eyes, grounding herself in the reality she knew, the reality the entity could not fully touch. "It's coming back," she murmured to herself, voice trembling, but steady. "And this time, it's smarter." Dr. Strange appeared in the room moments later, robes fluttering even without wind. His eyes, usually sharp and analytical, were clouded with concern. "Not just smarter," he said, "more patient. It's learned the limits of terror. Now it's probing endurance, planting doubt where fear cannot reach. It's studying how we recover, how we heal, and using that knowledge against us." Carol crossed her arms, floating slightly above the floor, energy thrumming faintly in her hands. "So what? It'll try to crush people quietly? Make them give up before we even see it?" Her voice held frustration, but also determination. "We've faced nightmare storms before. This, whatever it is, won't stop us." Ghost Rider's chains rattled as he stepped into the circle, skeletal jaw tight. "This one isn't just a shadow," he said. "It's a mirror. It reflects everything we fear in ourselves and everyone around us. And it's clever enough to know where we're weak. We can't burn it away. We can't hit it with light. We survive by being stronger than it thinks we are." Thor's expression was grave. He gripped Mjolnir, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the broken windows of the safe house. "It has learned patience, yes, but so have we. We endure, and when it overextends, it falters. That is when we strike. That is when we remind it that mortals, gods, and everything in between cannot be broken by shadows alone." The plan was simple, in theory, but impossible in practice. The entity thrived on chaos, on fractured perceptions, on the illusion of inevitability. To defeat it, the heroes would need to enter its domain, not physically but mentally. They would confront it inside the warped dreamscapes it had created, areas where the laws of reality bent to its will. Each would face their personal nightmares, amplified, distorted, and weaponized. Wanda shivered, recalling the last assault, the crushing weight of grief and memory the entity had forced upon her. "We'll have to go inside," she said, voice low. "We can't just defend, we have to be present. Every mind we enter, every fear we confront, we shape it. We guide people through their worst moments without letting it dominate. If we fail, the entity learns again." Carol's eyes glinted with quiet resolve. "Then we don't fail. Not this time. Not ever. We've seen what it can do, and we've seen what people can do when they refuse to surrender. We'll fight differently now." Ghost Rider's flames burned brighter, a warning and a promise. It doesn't care about our rules. It doesn't care about morals, about logic, about fairness. It only knows influence, and influence has limits. We find those limits and we make it bleed. Dr. Strange nodded, conjuring a map of intersecting realities, streams of astral energy weaving across the city and beyond. "We'll need every bit of focus. We enter its dreamscapes one by one, anchor civilians, and guide them through their worst visions. The risk isn't just physical, it's mental. If any of us falter, it spreads faster, infects more minds, and the city will fall before we can intervene." Thor placed a hand on Strange's shoulder. "And if it reaches beyond? If it escapes the boundaries we've prepared?" Strange exhaled slowly. "Then we fight with what we have: endurance, presence, choice. That is the only weapon it cannot consume or corrupt. That is the key. Every soul that refuses to give in, it weakens the entity. Every mind anchored in reality, it dies a little more inside." Lorraine felt the weight of the words, the reality of what they were about to do. No flash of light, no punch of a fist would be enough. This was war in the deepest sense. war of minds, of spirit, of resilience. And there would be no second chances. As night fell again, the city's shadows stretched long and unnerving, but in the distance, flames flickered not of terror, but of resolve. Ghost Rider's skull glowed steadily, a signal to those who watched that even in the darkest hour, someone remained unbroken. Wanda's magic shimmered faintly, illuminating the corners of perception. Thor's hammer rested against his shoulder, heavy with readiness. Carol's energy pulsed, a promise of persistence. The entity was returning, evolved, cunning, and ruthless. But so were they. And the first step in this final confrontation would be to enter the fractured nightmare, to navigate the warped reality it commanded, and to prove that even in the conjuring universe, there were limits to fear and infinite capacity for endurance. Outside, the city held its breath. Inside the thin veil between worlds, a storm was forming, and the heroes stepped forward. The first descent into the nightmare was subtle. One moment, the safe house stood solid and familiar. The next, the walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with shadows that whispered the names of everyone they had ever failed. A chill ran down Lorraine's spine as the air thickened, oppressive yet silent, like walking underwater in a room of unseen eyes. Dr. Strange raised a hand, incantations flowing in his mind, threads of astral light weaving through the distortion. Stay anchored. Focus on your purpose. Fear is a tool here, but it is a weapon we can disarm. His words were steady, but even he could feel the pull, the slow bending of reality as the entity reached through their veil, probing, testing, taunting. Carol felt it almost immediately. Her hands glowed faintly, energy shimmering. Yet the sensation was not of attack. It was memory, weight pressing on her chest. She gasped as visions of planets she couldn't save flashed before her eyes. Colonies burned, children screaming, worlds dissolving. Each failure magnified, replayed with cruel precision. She gritted her teeth, refusing to flinch. I am not alone, she whispered. I do what I can. That is enough. Even as the visions pressed in, the fire in her core refused to dim. Ghost Rider's chains rattled violently, the flames around his skull twisting with unnatural shapes. Shadows slithered into his form, and he saw faces. Friends he had failed. Innocents who perished while he rode on. Each figure reached for him, pleading and accusing. And for a brief moment, the fire dimmed. But then he spoke, voice low and unyielding. You cannot own my soul. You cannot claim what I refuse to surrender. Flames blazed brighter than the nightmares could touch, and the shadows hissed before scattering, leaving the air charged with molten heat. Thor's test was different, but no less harrowing. He stood in a ruined Asgard, golden halls now gray and hollow, echoes of his ancestors accusing him. He saw Odin's disappointed glare, glimpsed the suffering of a people he had failed to protect. The illusions were flawless, crafted with the knowledge of his deepest guilt. Yet he did not raise Mjolnir. Instead, he bowed, not in submission, but acknowledgement. I have failed, he admitted aloud, voice carrying across the ruins. And I will carry it, always. But I do not kneel to despair. The hall trembled, and the spirits flickered, uncertain, as if Thor's honesty disrupted the entity's grip. Wanda faced the most intimate nightmare. She found herself in a house she had never seen, yet every corner screamed of loss. Her children appeared, older than memory allowed, their eyes full of longing and accusation. She reached for them, but they melted into shadows each time she moved closer. The entity whispered, soft and coaxing, "Stay, forever. No one will hurt you again." Her knees buckled, her heart threatening to shatter under the weight of longing and grief. And then she remembered the faces of those she had helped, the lives she had saved despite her pain. She whispered firmly, "No, I do not yield to you. Pain is real, but it is not all." Slowly the illusions wavered. Lorraine moved carefully through the shifting dreamscape, senses sharp. The entity's influence was omnipresent, twisting perception, warping corridors into impossible geometries. Yet she focused on connection, reaching for the survivors scattered across the nightmare, grounding them with simple truths. You are here, you matter, you are not alone. Every person who resisted weakened the entity, strands of hope tangling with the hero's anchored presence. Strange, observing the chaos, realized the pattern. It learns. Every time we resist, it adapts. But resistance itself, mindful, anchored, shared, is the weakness it cannot overcome. We have to multiply it, not fight blindly. He guided civilians through impossible staircases, rooms that looped infinitely, hallways bleeding into walls. Each step was a battle of presence versus manipulation, of clarity versus illusion. The nightmares grew more aggressive. The entity fractured reality further, merging dreams, creating impossible juxtapositions of time and space. Streets twisted into endless halls. Familiar neighborhoods became arenas of loss and memory. The hero's senses strained under constant bombardment, each second testing their mental endurance. And yet, amidst the chaos, small victories appeared. Ghost Rider ignited flames that held shapes against the shadows. Thor's honesty shattered illusions. Carol's resolve burned through visions. Wanda's clarity peeled back layers of grief to reveal truth. Lorraine anchored civilians, weaving a fragile web of stability. Every act of courage, every refusal to surrender, forced cracks in the entity's domain. But the entity was cunning. It began to learn, weaving subtle doubts into the heroes' own minds, whispering that their victories were temporary, that every saved soul was just another failure waiting to happen. The line between nightmare and reality blurred. Even Strange, master of the mystic arts, felt the strain as the astral and physical realms intertwined. As the night deepened, the nightmare tested them in waves, relentless and intricate. Every hero faced not just fear, but the weight of responsibility, the shadows of their own regrets, the echoes of lives lost. They were being stretched, pulled in every direction, forced to confront the question the entity sought to make irresistible. Why fight when surrender seems inevitable? And then a single truth crystallized through the chaos. Surrender was optional. Choice still existed. Resistance was not about winning outright. It was about enduring, guiding, and refusing to be consumed. The nightmares, for all their power, could not claim what the heroes and those they protected chose to hold. In the heart of the nightmare, the entity paused, sensing the first signs of failure in its intricate design. The heroes were weary, battered, tested, but they were unbroken. And that pause, brief and almost imperceptible, was all they needed to prepare for the next wave. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and the faint metallic tang of fear. The nightmares had reached their apex, and even Ghost Rider's hellfire chains could barely keep the shifting shadows at bay. Streets folded into themselves, hallways looped infinitely, and time itself seemed to stretch like taffy. Every step carried danger, every glance risked triggering a memory twisted into terror. Yet for the first time, the heroes felt the tide shift. The entity had tested them enough. Now it was time to strike back. Doctor Strange hovered in the center of the distorted cityscape, astral threads weaving like a net across the warped skyline. He called the heroes together, their forms flickering between nightmare and reality. "We don't just survive," he said firmly. "We reclaim. Every illusion we break, every fear we expose is a wound to it. Strike precisely. Don't waste effort on spectacle." His eyes, steady and piercing, scanned the fractures in the nightmare. Patterns emerged. The entity thrived on doubt, not defiance. It faltered where clarity and connection persisted. Wanda stepped forward, her magic pulsing gently, almost like a heartbeat. She extended her hands, touching the fractured minds of the trapped civilians. "We reveal truth," she said softly, "not their fear, but how it was used against them. When they understand, the nightmare loses its power." She projected visions of manipulation, shadows that had whispered obedience now unraveling into faint, harmless threads. The civilians blinked, confused but free, stepping back from the abyss as their anchors solidified. Ghost Rider's chains lashed outward, flames carving paths through the darkness. Shadows screamed and recoiled at his touch, but he did not waste energy on them. Instead, he targeted the conduits, the cursed relics and dark symbols that the entity had embedded in the dreamscape. Each strike sent tremors across the warped streets, unraveling a section of the nightmare at its core. The fire burned without consuming the innocents nearby. It purified rather than destroyed. Thor's approach was simple yet effective. He strode into the chaos with Mjolnir raised, not to smite recklessly, but to assert presence. Lightning danced along the edges of the nightmare, illuminating hidden cracks, revealing where illusions had anchored themselves in reality. Every flash exposed a lie, a distortion. Thor roared, not in anger, but in authority. The shadows shrank where truth was spoken, retreating before the acknowledgement of endurance and honesty. Carol Danvers hovered above, absorbing the energy the entity hurled at the survivors and the heroes. Each wave of psychic pressure, each flash of manipulated memory, she turned into light, radiating reassurance and stability. "We are here," she shouted, voice carrying across fractured city blocks. "You do not fight alone. You never have." The words, simple and grounded, acted like mortar, reinforcing the fragile structures of the civilians' minds. Lorraine's role became increasingly vital. She moved through the civilians like a thread weaving through fabric, anchoring, comforting, correcting. "Name the fear," she instructed, voice calm but insistent. "Speak it aloud. See it for what it is. You own it. It does not own you." Each word, each small act of recognition, disrupted the nightmare's control. People began to stand hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction. The entity reacted violently, lashing out with visions designed to shatter concentration, twisted amalgamations of the hero's worst memories, haunting amalgams of failure and loss. Wanda countered with precise psychic shields. Ghost Rider illuminated the lies with purifying flames, and Strange reinforced every anchor with astral barriers. The nightmare cracked under the coordinated effort. Then came the turning point. A convergence point appeared in the center of the city, a pulsating void where the entity's presence was strongest. Strange gestured for the team to converge, each hero moving with purpose. "This is its core," he warned. "If we strike here, we destabilize the entire nightmare." Ghost Rider chained the void, flames flaring to their maximum intensity. Wanda pierced through its psychic shield, exposing the twisted essence beneath. Thor summoned lightning that split reality itself, revealing the fragility of the entity's dominion. Carol's light pushed through the shadows, illuminating the trapped civilians, now reclaiming their strength. Lorraine guided them to stand one by one, defiance flickering like sparks. The entity roared, a soundless scream that reverberated through every mind. It tried to coerce, to threaten, to twist the hero's own fears into weapons against them. But coordination, clarity, and anchored hope proved stronger than any nightmare. The void began to collapse, pieces of reality snapping back into form. Streets straightened, walls ceased breathing, and the suffocating chill of dread receded like a tide. Even as the collapse accelerated, the entity's voice lingered, whispering still, softer now, almost coaxing. "You will tire. You cannot protect them all. Why fight?" But the heroes ignored it. They focused not on perfection, not on saving every life at once, but on reclaiming what they could, guiding those who were ready and standing firm themselves. Resistance, they realized, was contagious. By the time the void imploded, the entity had lost its grip on the dreamscape entirely. The civilians were free, the illusions shattered, and the nightmares dissipated. The city, warped and broken for hours, returned to a semblance of reality. But the heroes knew the fight was not over. The entity might retreat, but it had learned, and it would return in ways they could not yet predict. Still, for the first time, they had the upper hand, not through sheer power, but through understanding, through connection, through enduring despite fear. The nightmare was broken, not destroyed, but diminished. Its authority evaporated in the face of humanity's choice to act, to resist, to reclaim themselves. And in that moment, Ghost Rider's flames burned brightest, illuminating a city that had stood against darkness and emerged alive. Not unscathed, but unbowed. The city lay in uneasy silence. Streets still bore the marks of hours spent in terror, shadows etched into walls, overturned debris, and the faint echo of screams fading like a distant storm. But the nightmare's pulse had weakened. Its tendrils, once stretching across minds and reality itself, now flickered, unstable, retreating into the corners between dimensions. Ghost Rider rode atop a crumbling rooftop, chains wrapped around his arms like serpents, eyes burning like molten coals. He could feel it, the entity, diminished, observing, calculating, waiting. Doctor Strange hovered nearby, his cloak fluttering despite their lack of wind. He traced astral sigils in the air, reinforcing the fragile boundaries that kept reality intact. "It's not gone," he said grimly, voice tight. "It's clever. Every defeat teaches it something new. It adapts to fear, to pain, to hesitation. But right now, it's vulnerable. We finish this tonight or it will fester, returning in ways we can't predict." Wanda, hands glowing faintly with crimson energy, stepped into the center of the deserted square. She had worked tirelessly for hours, guiding civilians through shattered visions, exposing their nightmares, teaching them to reclaim their memories. Her hair clung to her forehead, sweat and grief mingling, but her eyes shone with unyielding determination. "We can't just fight it with fire or magic," she said softly. "We fight it with awareness, understanding, choice. People need to remember they are not powerless." Thor landed beside her, hammer in hand, the thunderous shock of his landing reverberating through broken buildings. "Then we give them choice," he said firmly. "Not through fear, not through awe, through courage, through the simple act of standing, even when everything screams surrender." Carol hovered above, wings of radiant energy unfurling, her body a beacon of strength and hope. She absorbed the remaining psychic residue of the entity's influence, turning it into light. Every moment of doubt it tried to ignite in the survivors' minds she snuffed out, not with force, but with reassurance. "We protect the vulnerable," she said. "We do not become them. We fight with what we are." The nightmare stirred, sensing the shift. Shadows coalesced into forms, twisted faces of the dead, familiar figures from the hero's past, distorted children and friends, all attempting to distract, to seduce, to corrupt. Its voice, once a roar of absolute command, was now a whisper curling in the corners of every mind. "You cannot save them all. Surrender is mercy. Resistance is pain. It is inevitable." Ghost Rider stepped forward, flames licking along the chains, the hellfire burning hotter than ever. "I don't deal in mercy," he said, voice a gravelly echo of wrath. "I deal in choice. And you? You've lost that right." He swung his chain, striking the nearest shadow, which dissolved into sparks and ash. Each blow he landed was surgical, targeting not the innocents or their fears, but the nightmare's anchors, the cursed threads it had woven to control the city. Strange raised his hands, weaving a final spell designed not to banish, but to contain and fragment. Astral chains snaked through the nightmare, locking its essence into fissures that would prevent it from coalescing fully. The entity thrashed violently, but it was no longer omnipotent. Wanda extended her magic in tandem, creating psychic beacons for civilians, letting them see the entity's manipulations laid bare. Shock, anger, and clarity surged through the minds of those trapped, severing its influence. The entity shrieked, a soundless cry that rattled the edges of reality. Buildings trembled as the nightmare attempted a last desperate assault, lashing at the heroes with memories of failure and regret. But Carol's light blazed. Thor's lightning split the illusions. Ghost Rider's flames burned away corrupted echoes, and Strange's containment magic wove a cage impossible to break. Wanda's voice cut through the chaos. "It is not reality. You choose to stand. You choose life. You choose to fight." A single, pivotal moment crystallized the battle. A child, trembling but awake, stepped forward from a ruined playground. No hero guided him. No magic shielded him. He simply took a deep breath, lifted his head, and refused to bow to fear. That small act rippled outward. Adults followed, neighbors followed, survivors followed. Each act of defiance weakened the nightmare, exposing it like paper burned at the edges. Its once mighty dominion was shredded by human courage, not by divine or infernal power. Ghost Rider roared, chains raised high, as the final strands of darkness writhed and collapsed into nothing. The nightmare let out one last unformed cry, then vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of the city and the heavy breaths of those who had endured. The streets were ruined, but they were theirs. The nightmare would never again hold sway here. Not as absolute, not as ruler, not as God. It had been diminished, starved of fear, fragmented into irrelevance. The heroes stood together, battered but unbroken. Thor looked to the sky, the storm cleared, and whispered, "We have survived, not because we are perfect, but because we endure." Ghost Rider's flames softened, burning low, a reminder that judgment is not only fire, it is choice, responsibility, and resilience. Wanda knelt beside a survivor, offering a hand, a quiet word. Carol's light shone gently, not blinding, but warm. Strange surveyed the cityscape, silent yet vigilant. For the first time since the invasion began, the nightmare did not loom. It would return somewhere, someday. But here, now, humanity had reclaimed its power. Not through awe, not through fear, but through standing, choosing, and refusing to surrender. And in that, they were stronger than any dark force. As Ghost Rider rode through the streets one last time, the flames reflecting in shattered windows, he knew the truth. Evil adapts, fear endures. But human will, the fragile, stubborn, relentless will, was indestructible. And somewhere beyond the veil, the entity lingered, reduced to whispers and embers. Knowing this universe would never bow to it, not completely, not willingly. The last embers of night had burned, and humanity, bruised and broken, stood alive.